Good morning, everyone. My name is Patrick Green, and I'm here to talk to you about shared values. Actually, I'm here to talk to you about employee share ownership as part of a wider piece of economic reinvention and the improvement and refinement of capitalism as we know it. You may notice on the program it says shared values, and there's a capital D and a capital S. And this came actually from an idea that you start with share value, and from there you get shared value, and from there you can move to shared values. And I'll talk a little bit more about that at the end, but I wanted to give you the quick highlight points because this is a soapbox pitch. It's fast, it's furious, and we're not going to get into a huge amount of depth, but I hope that we'll touch on enough of it and the aspects which is interesting enough for you to take this idea away and think it might be worth promoting more widely. So what's the idea? The idea is much wider and more inclusive share ownership. The premise for that idea is if you decide to choose capitalism as your model, everyone's got to be able to have some capital participation in society. Otherwise, it's only a model that is working for some people. And that's pretty uncontroversial. I think Maggie Pagano was saying something about that yesterday. And it's from that premise that the proposal departs. That's the what. What's the when? Well, the when, I think, is urgent and now and as soon as possible for lots of reasons, which I'll develop more in a moment. But I think we are at a watershed moment for the United Kingdom as we contemplate Brexit and what the world looks like post-Brexit, but also because of some fundamental changes that have taken place domestically. The gig economy, different ways of working, controversy about how people participate in the workplace abound. And so I think there are lots of reasons why this is becoming increasingly urgent, particularly because when people are disenfranchised, they will vote for extreme solutions which may not have the required element of reality to them. So the why. Now the why, the real why reason is because there is a need to reimagine for the future how people across this country are going to participate in our economy in years to come. And we are not going to successfully do that if we do it looking back over our shoulders at 1970s labour relations and saying, couldn't we bring back some of those wonderful ideas? Because the workplace has changed, how people want to participate in the economy has changed, and the opportunities to participate in the economy have changed. And more widely, that's all taken part in a completely different global economic weather system. And that is, we are now more dependent than ever on discretionary effort, discretionary risk-taking, discretionary allocation of capital, and a discretionary participation in the life of the nation. And so it's all of those things together create opportunities, but also create a serious danger of massive disenfranchisement. So that's the first reason. The second is that, as Philip Blond was emphasizing, and as was Liam Byrne in the earlier session, there is an importance to property ownership and having access to some capital, which goes beyond the mere idea of engaging employees successfully. Maggie Pagano last night mentioned in her speech that the statistics on employee share ownership are clear. Better retention, better productivity, greater innovation, and usually higher profits. So I spoke to quite a senior economist who it would be unfair to name, and she said to me, look, I think this is a complete no-brainer. And I think actually from an objective standpoint, this is a complete no-brainer. Picking up on two of the points that Liam Byrne and Philip Blond both touched on earlier, wage stagnation is a serious social danger at the moment. And we have to try to engineer policies and platforms which will deliver the ability of companies and individuals successfully to address the problem of wage stagnation. And that is addressed by this proposal in two ways. First of all, by the increase in productivity and employee engagement that wider employee share ownership brings, it's perfectly clear that that is going to be your best chance at increasing wage levels through productivity gains. Discretionary innovation, discretionary effort, and so forth, all point strongly in that direction. The other thing that Philip Bond was very keen to emphasize is that wages alone are very unlikely to deliver prosperity. And what you've got to try and do is give people access to capital and capital growth, access to dividend streams, and wages and salaries. And this becomes particularly important when you look forward to the future of AI, robotics, and increased automation and changes in the landscape of the workplace. Because you can readily see that the reaction of an employee who has his wage but also has a dividend, to the proposal to introduce a new AI model, which will massively increase profits in the company and efficiency, might be very different to an employee who's only dependent on gaining a wage for their particular job. Another good reason supporting this proposal is that it provides a credible alternative to the state as the sole redistributive agent in society. And not only that, and this is an absolutely crucial point, there's a huge debate in the area of negotiation and dispute resolution about how you harness the creation of value in a negotiation for everyone and the distribution of that value between the parties. It's like a massive topic, and I won't bore you with it. But ironically, it's reflected in our public affairs too. And what we need is not just solutions that redistribute value. We need solutions that help to create value, more value for everyone, as well as distributing it much more widely. And this leads to the final reason. The whole equity project, as the project that I'm working on in this area is called, is designed not just to deliver employee share ownership on a wider basis, but also because it speaks to a much greater sense of fairness in society and participation in society by everyone as principals as well as employees and in other ways. And I thought I'd end by just giving two really quick examples. Relatively large company with 2,000 employees. Employees become shareholders all over Eastern Europe. CEO visits. Polish guy working in the warehouse comes up and says, excuse me, you know who I'm talking about. Excuse me, we need to build some more stores. Can I just show you? I know it's going to cost, we think it might cost 2 million euros, but we need to build some more stores, and I want to show you why. This is an employee, quite a low-level employee in the organization, thinking as an owner of the business in a former Eastern European country. And the other end of the spectrum, that was a fairly mature business. At the other end of the spectrum, a tech company where it was almost obligatory Converse trainers. The offices were bare brick walls and mainly lit by the Apple lights on the back of the laptops. And it was all extremely cool and fun when there were 6 of them. And it was fairly cool and fun when there were 12, 15, 19. Got to 35, and suddenly there was a little bit of, yeah, sorry, that's actually my job. Do you mind? Yeah, that's my job. And they then had a process by which they educated the employees about their existing stock and their stock options and what that meant in real terms and what that would look like when the company's goals were finally achieved. They said, so it's very simple. If we don't do any of these 7 things, we get to 18 months' time, your stock is worth nothing, you don't have a job. If we do all 7 of them, your stock will be worth this much, and you will have a job and more. If we do 3 or 4 of them, we're in good shape, maybe not peak valuation for the next funding round, but we're in great shape. And it did take, he said, about 5 weeks, but there was an absolutely radical change in that business. And people started saying, hey, but you know that guy, you got on really well with him. Do you mind to take that meeting and I'll do that boring thing you were doing? There's a radical change getting people to think as well as participate in companies, the economy, and society as principals with dominion over their own lives and a real stake in society. Thank you.
There's a hooligan blowing a whistle in the front row. Who let him in? Patrick, we're a self-organising session, it seems. So I'm speaking next, but we can take some questions and chat about Patrick's stuff first. But the overarching question for me is, having gone through all sorts of types of accidental, almost, employee and stakeholder share ownership schemes in the past with government, why isn't this more popular?
Well, I mean, that's a massive question, and I think something I didn't quite have time to fit in. But what we actually need to do, and I had a brief chat with Ian Byrne about this, about changing the Companies Act to allow different metrics for companies to be prioritised by the directors in the discharge of their duties. But I also think, really simple thing, which I think both he and Philip Blond thought would be quite useful, is a reduced level of corporation tax for employee-owned companies that fulfill certain basic criteria. You say, look, guys, you're going to be paying 4% less corporation tax if you're an employee-owned entity. I think there are also some, if I can just, as a footnote to that, if you look at a whole group of coders who want to have a coding cooperative, yeah, at the moment we don't really have the proper vehicles in law to allow them to get together in the way that they want to work together. And so it's all a sort of sticking plaster over here, and then we'll have an agreement over here. We also need to invent some new corporate entities to allow this idea of equity participation.
Okay, cool. Question at the back.
Just going to make an observation. About 3 years ago, I took the 30 largest UK companies quoted on the stock exchange, and I added up their asset value invested in their pension funds, which I believe pension funds are owned by the employees. It would actually have bought 30% of the whole of the market capitalisation. So actually we do have employee ownership, but it's in a mess of a structure in which it's managed. And we really need to have a heavy policy look at getting the employees and the owners of the pension fund to manage their funds properly. Thank you.
Can you pass the mic forward to our host, Tim? We'll take a few questions at once.
Thank you very much.
The mic then means it goes on the video, in case you're wondering.
I was just going to ask Patrick about really radical ideas for how we could solve the problem, because what you've described, I've seen incredibly clearly. Last business I used to be a director of before going to Parliament was a farming company run by some very sort of Quaker-minded East Anglians, and everybody in the business, 150 years old, everyone owned shares. At the AGM, the whole business stopped, the forklift driver came in, and we went through the company's accounts. When I was Minister for Business, you go around UK biotech companies, no one owns stock, even the management only owns shares. I go to America and see a biotech company, the forklift driver's got stock, he's got 2 phones, and he's tracking the share price during the day. A totally different culture. We have a real problem. 30 years after an enterprise revolution, very few people are actually owning equity in the underlying asset. And I think it's quite shaming, particularly for those of us who cheered on that revolution, that it's not more widely shared. How far would you go in accelerating that?
I think very far, very fast. And there's also a much deeper medium-term issue of educating teenagers about participation in risk and equity ownership.
Thank you, Patrick. Your point about timing, it strikes me that with equity values a function at a result of QE, and therefore there could be a big smash coming. If that smash happens, that moment after would be a fantastic time to make this happen, because if we do it before, it'll have a very negative effect on people's support for it. If we do it just after, it might be part of what they'll see as a salute recovery.
But I mean, that
on a
might,
better model.
I think A, that's a really good point, but B, we shouldn't wait for it, because actually what you could say, one of the biggest barriers, and it's an answer to George in a way, one of the biggest barriers to giving loads of employees shares, my family business did it, and the biggest barrier is you give them shares, they're very valuable, they have to pay the tax. Yeah. So we actually had to pay the tax for them, right? But I mean, it makes it super expensive. The Exchequer, also, as soon as you give the employees shares, the Exchequer gets the money back within about 18 months if you look at the models. So actually, the urgent way of doing that is say, well, if you give these shares to the employees, they're not going to pay tax on them. You get a massive, it's like council house sales, except you replace them. You get a massive enfranchisement of people who are suddenly equity owners and participants in capitalism instead of wage slaves.
Thanks. My name's Tim Levine. I've been a tech investor and entrepreneur for 20 years, so I've been part of many businesses where we've provided stock to all staff, and in fact it's an underlying principle that everybody has to be incentivized. I think we've got 2 big challenges. One it's complicated. There is a number of different schemes depending on the type of company and the amount of shares. And as the company grows and becomes more valuable, then you need to restructure the whole share ownership scheme. And secondly, and more importantly, is a lack of liquidity. And it's taking too long for employees and owners to get that liquidity. We have a dearth of IPO in this country. And so certainly in my world of tech, we are seeing nowhere near enough exits. And the businesses that I've been involved with for over 20 years ago, when we do get liquidity, a lot of that money gets recycled into the next generation of entrepreneurial ideas. And that's what we need to do. So we've got a structural issue, both in the tax scheme and then in the opportunity to generate that liquidity.
I'll just make a very quick comment on that. I mean, you're absolutely right on both points. One thing I would say, I mean, my day job is a lawyer. I actually would prefer less law, and I would prefer a really simple, easy mechanism that doesn't have to be restructured. Because the reason you have these schemes is to actually try and mitigate the tax burden on employees. If you said, by the way, guys, there's no tax burden when you give employees £5,000 worth of shares each. No, they don't pay any tax on it. Yeah, all the need to have 4.5 hours with an accountant 3 times a week goes. Yeah, so simplify, and then you're touching on a much bigger tip of the iceberg on the our late adopters funding gap issues. But we'll have to push on.
Last question here.
Hi, Patrick. So my name's Stuart. I actually run a company called Broker Compare, which is trying to get more people investing, and it's raising money on Crowdcube at the moment, which brings me to the next point of have you engaged with Seeders and Crowdcube who are trying to build secondary markets? Because that's actually a really good way where privately listed companies could enable their existing employees to buy shares, but then sell them if they wanted to when they left.
Well, I've actually invested in a company trying to build a secondary market service for small tech businesses to get over the liquidity issue. But the underlying point is that if you look at Gripple, for example, which is an amazing example of they will not employ anyone unless they buy £1,000 worth of shares. So you want a job sweeping, cleaning up at Gripple, you have to buy £1,000 worth of shares. The company will lend you the money at the Bank of England base rate to buy them. But if you want a job at Gripple, you buy £1,000 worth of shares. But they have a separate company now that acts as the internal broking market for all the Gripple companies in, I think, about 7 countries. So that employees who suddenly think, I need to buy a house, deposit be helpful, I need another 10 grand, can sell their shares to do that. So I agree, super important. There's too much to talk about. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Patrick. I can't really follow that, but mind you, a lawyer who wants less law, let's pickle him, eh? My name's William Perrin. Most of you won't know who the hell I am. I was a civil servant for 15 years. Before I started, I had a full head of hair, didn't need glasses, and only weighed 12 stone. It ruins you. I worked for a whole variety of people, including Tony Blair. I was his communications policy advisor. I was a civil servant who largely created Ofcom a long time ago, sort of almost 20 years ago now. When I left the civil service, I ended up helping both Labour and the Conservatives when they were in opposition with various bits of policy, including, heaven help me, Steve Hilton and Nat Way on the big society stuff, which when they got into government, I'd like to say they ruined rather than I ruined. I do a lot of work, though, on communications regulation and policy, and I've just done a big piece for Carnegie UK Trust, the UK and international think tank on Brexit and digital communications. And one of the things, for those of you who know there's a few people from the tech sector here, but not everyone will realise quite the extent to which the communications sector in the UK is totally and utterly enmeshed in the European system, both in regulation. There's this great irony that the European regulation of telecoms, of broadband, mobile phones, and aspects of broadcasting it regulates almost all come from a UK model. UK civil servants working in Brussels did that work about 15 or 20 years ago. And over the years, there's this great European irony that we got most European companies and markets to converge rather on a UK model than we've seen in almost any other sector, particularly, except possibly financial services. And when we Brexit, there could, of course, be very profound implications for how that sector works. And I've been looking at how the government is approaching that Brexit process. And generally, on many areas, I found it doing a relatively good job, given the difficult circumstances it's in, of maintaining a steady as she goes approach to communications regulation. They said we'll be copying across almost all the EU laws into the new English idiom, and also we'll be introducing a massive new bill on data, an entirely European. We're going to drop into a parliament in the heart of the Brexit process to make sure that great British technology companies continue to work with their European counterparts and to serve European customers. And that's been a tremendous commitment from the government, although they haven't given much more detail beyond that. But I think there are a couple of areas where Brexit can bring about an advantage for the UK communications market, but not necessarily one that's seen from a commercial viewpoint, very much more from a consumer viewpoint. The UK was very, very quick out of the blocks and very quick to develop what appears to be a competitive market for communications services, buying your broadband, your mobile phone, your TV packages. We have a massive choice in the market, but we're starting to see, as Philip Blond touched on earlier, and other economists are starting to write about in the last few months, that the communications market isn't working in the UK in the consumer interest at all. The Citizens Advice did a very good piece of work 2 years ago. They did some financial analysis and decided that there was about £4.2 billion pounds a year of consumer detriment in the telecoms market because of its lack of switching. Companies have constructed brilliant packages that people found it very, very hard to switch out of. And the vision that Norman Tebbit set out in 1983-84, when he privatised BT, of people being able to choose between communications providers, wasn't actually happening in the real world, in the face of the consumer offer. But the EU is about to take away our ability to correct that through regulation. The EU has a set of proposals known as the Digital Single Market, which are coming up in the next 2 or 3 years. And in that, amongst many other things, it removes the right of member states to regulate in detail these consumer markets. Just at a time when in the UK we realised that the competition isn't really working, there's a 4.2 billion or at least a very, very large consumer detriment, and we need to return to aspects of regulation in that market. And it's not something I would normally advocate, but it's a very, very broken market. So Ofcom flagged this up 18 months ago, and I think there's some space for the British government in negotiation to say to Brussels, OK, we'll go with 99% of your thrust of regulation, everything that's there we can go for, but we'll just shade out a little bit aspects of the digital single market you want to bring in the future. And it's this area that's fascinating around Brexit, that because we're stuck on the very big arguments at the moment, we've not seen much exploration of. Where are the areas in which we can deviate a little from the European median or direction of travel in order to reflect British circumstances, but still fit within the general overall thrust of European regulation? And this generic space has not really been thought through. But I think there's some potential there. I also think there's some potential to look at the disastrous broadband market in the UK, particularly in the rural fringes, where I'm fortunate enough to have a house about 15 miles from here up in the Chiltern Hills. It's nearly impossible to get broadband, despite everything Ed Vaizey has done over the years, and I regularly torment him about this on the radio and elsewhere. I've had to set up a broadband not-for-profit, bring in some alternative providers who are not BT, to bring broadband to a number of isolated rural communities. And we've started to run out of options at the rural fringes to fix bad broadband. And this is an issue that's plagued the Conservative Party in the Commons. Obscure Westminster Hall debates, which normally tumbleweed blows through. Over 100 Conservative backbenchers turn up to complain loudly and bitterly about the state of rural broadband. So I think there's a bit of scope for deviation from the European median here, to actually allow a little bit more state intervention in those margins. We're seeing local authorities at all levels now becoming very concerned about the economic impact of poor broadband in rural areas. This is their ability to involve, to actually set up a broadband company is inhibited by European case law, a case known as the Wireless Prague case. And I think there's an opportunity there for the UK, again, in negotiation to deviate a little bit from the European norm. There's a whole range of other aspects of regulation that will sit around Brexit, but the one area that is outside the regulatory space is the government's ability to manage the digital workforce, the European digital workforce. Many of you here from tech companies will have a substantially European workforce. We still don't know where they will be over the next 2 or 3 years. And this could have a very serious deleterious effect on the sector if the government doesn't adequately manage the challenges they face. So very briefly, I think there are some advantages to be had. We're good. There are some advantages to be had in Brexit, but they themselves, for the digital sector, but they come from looking at this very nerdy but quite important area of where can we deviate a bit from the European mean, the European median, but still stay within the broad envelope of European regulation, sufficient to say, yeah, we satisfy your single market rules, but we're no longer in it. That's it.
Any quick questions?
Quick questions before lunch?
Just one very quick one. I've got a nerdy specialist interest in your area, but is it realistic that we're going to get any deviation whatsoever in our negotiations?
Yeah, I think it is a little bit around the edges, but it depends. Can the UK government actually prioritise it within its wider gamut of things it's negotiating? That's the bigger question. Yeah, there must be a little bit around the edges because you see that in all sorts of marginal areas with the EU. There's always a bit of room, and what I'm putting down here are things that are not massive deviations. They're only quite small ones, but still could reflect the particular circumstances of the UK market. But we'll see. Any other questions? Go and get some lunch. Thank you very much.
Well,